Hello, strangers. Let's talk about the encounter with U3 from Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 is a survival horror game originally released for the GameCube and for the PlayStation 2 shortly after that. It is full of interesting boss fights, and the fight with U3 stands out in particular as well done, unnerving, and effective. This is probably in large part due to Shinji Mikami. Shinji Mikami is a director who has a habit of taking boss fights that, on paper, sound like they should be miserable slogs, and he takes these concepts and makes them into really solid experiences. I don't know how his bosses didn't think he was nuts when he presented these concepts. So, I'm designing the cavern area boss fight. Okay, let's hear it. It's gonna be on a time limit? Oh, and there'll be quick time events? And there'll be, puzzles you have to do to progress? Oh, and the whole area will be a maze. And the entire time you're trying to progress, the boss is attacking you. How do you defeat him? What do you mean defeat him? In most games, this would sound hellish, but here the elements were balanced in such a way to make the U3 fight memorable and rather nerve-wracking. The first time the player sees U3 is during a cutscene. The player doesn't see U3 at first. The floor begins to shake and the cavern begins to rumble, and then it bursts through a wall, blasting the player off a cliff and into a cage suspended over a chasm. U3 follows, and the player gets a nice long look at just what they'll be facing. This introduction is a very dynamic and unexpected entrance, and U3's ability to burst through solid stone shows the player just how powerful it is, which shows the player how dangerous it is. This scene also gives the player their first good look at U3. Now, normally seeing the monster might not be the best choice. Not being sure what the monster looks like can do a lot towards making the monster scarier. There's a reason you never get to see the monster from Amnesia. See? That just looks silly. However, in this case, I think this was a good decision. U3 is creepy. It clearly used to be human, and is mutated into some strange centaur-like hybrid with a tentacle for an arm. This is a good design. It stays creepy even when we look at it for a long time. Seeing it adds to the fear, rather than detracting from it. Although the player won't be able to get a good look at it for much of the fight, seeing U3 here and allowing the player to attack it teaches an important mechanic for this part of the boss fight, which is that when you can see U3, attacking it will make it retreat to the top of the cages. In fact, about the only time you can get a good look at U3 is when you're able to attack it. Knowing that this is crawling around on the ceiling and can drop in at any moment doesn't hurt much either. Once the player lands, they have to find the buttons that unlock the door leading to the next cage. U3 has flung itself in after the player as well, hell-bent on killing them. This puts a lot of pressure on the player, as they have to figure out how to proceed while trying to avoid U3. Unlocking the cage unbalances it for some reason, and a timelet appears at the top of the screen. There are 3 cages to get through, and the player has to find buttons to open doors in order to progress through each cage, and the cages get progressively more difficult. There are a few elements here that make this encounter particularly stressful. For one, there's the time limit, which adds a sense of urgency to the encounter. If the player gets too turned around trying to get back to the doors, or gets too distracted by U3, they will learn that the cage goes plummeting into the chasm below. You only learn that your specific doom is death by fall if you fail, but given that the cages are suspended above an abyss, a siren blares as the timer runs down, and Leon mentions something about the cage being unstable, it's no surprise that failing to beat the clock results in instant death. Each cage has its own time limit. Oddly, once you make your way through a cage, it plummets into the abyss regardless of how much time is left for that cage. The time limit is also used to exacerbate tension from other elements by not allowing the player much time to calm or center themselves. The cages themselves have a very claustrophobic atmosphere. Each cage is like a mini-maze, which makes it more difficult to return to the cage door in time before the cage falls. There isn't a lot of space for the player to move in, and occasionally you three will drop through a hole in the ceiling, partially blocking a path and compressing an already tight space. This forces the player to waste time and ammo, shooting at U3 until he retreats. Also, there are QuickTime events. The QuickTime events come when U3 attacks the player from above. I actually didn't find the QuickTime events to be that difficult. While they certainly add to the somewhat frantic nature of the fight, it always felt like the developers gave us a decent amount of time to respond after the prompt appeared on the screen. They're also paced well enough that they never overpower the other elements. The QuickTime events amplify the stress and fear the player is feeling. Had they been done poorly, they would have lent themselves to frustration and tedium. Instead, the mechanic keeps the player on their toes without being so difficult that it derails the fight into an annoying minigame. Even when it's not attacking, U3's presence is constantly known. You can hear it moving around on the top of the cage, growling and grunting. It is a steady reminder of the danger present. This, along with the unpredictability of its attacks, does a lot towards keeping the player on edge. It makes U3 feel inescapable, which, for this section of the fight, he is. There is a lot in this encounter that not only makes it a frightening encounter, but keeps it a frightening encounter. There's a delicate balance going on of keeping things frantic without overwhelming the player to the point where the fight becomes more frustrating than scary. Frustration can ruin fear. And while this is, in my opinion, the most difficult boss in the game, it never became so insurmountable as to become tedious. When a player messes up and gets killed, it is usually fairly easy to discern why it happened. Each type of failure, whether time limit, quick time events, or simply U3 dropping in, has its own unique death. It is usually pretty easy to correct what you did wrong. When I first played the game, it only took me about 3 attempts to make it through the cages. I had to be on my toes the entire time, and this stress made the fight rather nerve-wracking, but I often didn't make the same mistake twice. Even the maze-esque qualities of the cages didn't create too much of a hindrance, because it was simple enough to learn what the wrong direction was and to not go that way. This kept the fight from getting repetitive. Repetition breeds familiarity, and familiarity and frustration can go a long way towards ruining the horror in a game. It's hard to be scared of something when you're bored. Another thing that keeps the fight from becoming too harrowing is that the puzzles are relatively simple. The player has to find and destroy control panels that are keeping doors closed, then navigate through the maze to find a button that opens the cage door. These puzzles aren't too tricky by themselves, but the difficulty is upped with the control panels being in unexpected places and with U3's periodic attacks. There's also a small safe area inside the third cage, which is the largest and most difficult of the cages. It contains a hollowed-out shipping container, and when the player is inside the shipping container, U3 can't get to them. Allowing the player a moment to gather themselves without having to completely pause the game helps to keep the fight from getting stale. Not only is it another tactic to combat the risk of frustration, the time limit means you can't bask in safety for long. All of these elements work well in creating a unique, engaging, and tense encounter. U3's introduction gives the player an idea of what they'll be dealing with. The game keeps the player on edge while they work through the cages with a time limit, puzzles, and quick time events, and U3 itself is a constant threat. After you've escaped the cages, you do get to fight the fucker head on, but the developer seems to have run out of ideas. You have to include a way for players to defeat the boss, Mikami! U3 appears to have plummeted into the chasm with the final cage, but it turns out U3 just will not go down that easy. He scurries up the chasm wall to throw the player into the actual fight portion of the boss fight. This half of the fight isn't as dynamic as the first. The cage portion of the fight feels very frantic, and while there is still tension at this point, it has ebbed considerably. The claustrophobic tightness of the cages is gone, replaced by an area that the player can move more freely in, and there's no more time limit, so only your health and ammo are stopping you from dragging this fight out as long as you want. Don't worry though, the quick time events are still here. This fight may not be as hectic, but it is still pretty stressful. U3 is a bullet sponge, and while there is a trick to this fight and exploding fire barrels to do more damage, it still takes a while for him to actually go down. This section could be viewed as a falling action, a lowering of the tension before it gets released. When the tension drops, it feels like a relief. You no longer have to worry about QuickTime events, time limits, or U3 trying to eat your face off. It's over, and the player can finally breathe again. This is a really well done boss fight. It took a lot of elements that would normally become tedious or frustrating and balanced them in such a way that it generated a frantic sort of tension. The second half of the fight works in letting the pressure ebb before finally being released. The result is a tense, memorable, and effective encounter that keeps players on edge. It is a great boss fight from a great game. Until next time, stay spooky, dear strangers.